Okay, I think we should start. You guys ready? I'm Matana. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. You have joined Vytal and Local's webinar on Gen Z employees. My name is Matana. I'm one of the co-founders with Natalie as another co-founder of Vytal. Vytal does, we specialize in Gen Z research and insights for first mover Gen Zers. And we are joined by our partners at Local. Locals help organizations make change stick. The simple premise behind Local is that leaders, teams, and employees are customers. To reach employees more effectively, Local retools consumer marketing to work inside of companies, something they call change marketing. So today's session features two Gen Zers, Alex, who works in tech sales. And Alex, say hi.
Hi, I'm Alex. Nice to meet you all.
And Tyus, who works as a full-time bartender, restaurant service worker.
How you doing? I'm Tyus.
And this panel discussion will be led by Natalie. Natalie will moderate the discussion. She will take everyone through some insights and findings, as well as ask Alex and Tyus for their feedback on the various points we're making. After this session, towards the end of this session, we've set aside time for Q&A. We have some questions that have already come in, but please, if you have any questions as the participants are speaking, you'll take your mouse to the bottom where you should have a Q&A button. You can go ahead and type in your questions anytime during the session. Thank you. I'll be in the background just taking notes.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Matana. And Matana, can you also run the deck as well, so I can still have control of my computer? Great. Thank you. So hi, everyone. Hi, Ty and Alex. Good to see you guys again. So welcome to the Retention Revolution webinar. We're really excited to share what we found with you today. This webinar is focused on basically what is really important to Gen Z in the workplace. There's a lot of articles, a lot of communication out there, some of what you may know already, some of what may be new to you. So we really wanted to provide something that was a bit of a different perspective than something that you might have already read, might have already heard. And so what we did was we prepped the panelists, so Alex and Ty, and we really dug deep into what are their work experiences, what have been differences over the previous years, how has COVID changed the work experience, and really driving down into what are the core emotional drivers that Gen Z is looking for in their workplace. What does that mean practically for you guys who are listening? So what are changes you can make that are easy to make? What are interesting elements that we think it might be important for you to hear about the perspectives of youth? What are some myth busting that we can do as well? And so all that's going to be included in what we'll be discussing today. We can go to the next slide and I'll share with you our agenda. So we kind of consolidated everything into 3 core themes that came out of the prep work that we've done prior to this webinar. And so you've just met the panelists, and then we're going to go into workplace boundaries. So what does that mean? What is the depth of that? What is important to our audience members, especially in terms of the humanization of the workplace with people, not positions? What does that mean practically? What are those expectations? How do you keep a Gen Z employee happy? And then down to infantilization in the workplace. And this is really around this concept of what are the responsibilities and roles that Gen Z is looking to fulfill? What are the social elements that are challenging or making tension to those goals that are not matching in terms of employee workplaces and Gen Z employees? And then at the end, we'll take some questions as well. So if you have questions for any of the individual panelists, questions in general, feel free to go look at the bottom of your screen, that little Q&A icon. Click on that, put your question in there, and we'll be sure to get to all the questions at close. We should have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to dedicate to questions. Okay, so we'll jump right in. So what we heard is that work boundaries feel like tango. It feels like a very complex, very specific kind of dance, and that isn't being done at a very high level or very well. The comfort that people are looking for is not being provided. The boundaries are being crossed, the clarity around what those boundaries are, the mutual agreements that everyone wants to have. There isn't that mutuality, it feels like. And so we're going to dive into 3 key things that we heard about why that is, what's important, and then we're going to ask the question as well to the panelists so you can hear live from them. So here are 3 key things that we pulled out of the conversation. And one of those that we found really interesting was this concept of mutual agreements, this idea of in the explicit nature. This might seem a little different, maybe from previous generations, where there's more of an implicit conversation that's happening. There's rules that exist, there's ways of interacting that exist, there's things you may not say openly, things you may want to not necessarily conceal, but just not be as bold in terms of the communication. And that is really not reflective of where this generation is going. And so really that level of explicit conversation, that level of mutual agreement that's very clear and detailed is really important. And that trust and confidence that they can have these open conversations, they can communicate openly is very important for these environments. And so to be in an environment that doesn't have that explicit nature can be very confusing and detrimental to the happiness and also productivity. Familiarity and professionalism. So this was a balancing act that we heard consistently was not balanced well. And this idea of there is friendliness, and obviously there's a lot of research you guys may have heard about of people want to work with their friends, right? So companies take a lot of effort to try and build relationships among employees. You have drinks after work, you might have dinners, you might have activities, you might have even special activity building programs that happen. But there still feels like there's an empty intimacy that's happening. So maybe the friendliness that's happening is maybe inappropriate, or it isn't delivering that true intimacy, that true connection. And we'll hear from the audience panels themselves about exactly what that means. But there is a lot of familiarity, but there isn't that intimacy, there isn't that trust. And so that creates kind of a difficult situation to be happy, to feel confident in your work environment, to feel confident in the conversations that you're having. In addition to some of the panels feeling that some of those boundaries feel that professionalism can be crossed too. Maybe we're at drinks, we're talking about things that we actually don't have the relationship to discuss. We don't have that intimacy built up. And so it creates this like faux intimacy that doesn't support the true intimacy that's required to operate a successful team. And psychological safety was another big one. This idea that the environment should be a safe environment, not because things aren't stated, not because there's faux intimacy that's being created, but a truly safe environment, meaning I can bring myself to work, I can communicate exactly what my needs are, what I feel, you're communicating directly back to me. I believe that there is nothing that is implicit or between the lines in terms of what you're sharing with me, and everyone's on the same page. There is that mutual agreement. So that safety to express themselves, that safety to make mistakes, and that safety to grow. And we'll hear in some of the next elements how growth is super important to this generation as well. And Alex, we have a quote from you where you say you think trust and vulnerability and a sense of psychological safety are all bundled together. And that's at the root. Without those things, it's really just a lack of comfort. And I think everyone in the audience can understand when you're not comfortable, nothing's really going to function well. We can go to the next slide. So I'd love to hear from you guys, and we can start with you, Alex. What are the top 3 boundaries you believe are essential in a healthy workplace?
Yeah, I think respectful communication. Communication is a big one for me. I, of course, always expect to be addressed and spoken to in a way that is humanizing and that I would expect from any of my friends or people in the world. So I want that in my workplace also. And another piece/boundary around communication and in general is just being transparent. I think if there is true honesty and you're seeing that the transparency and the cadence of being honest about whatever the regulations you're being placed under, there's a litany of different things, but being able to truly trust that you're being told correct information creates a sense of psychological safety that for me always leads to better performance, and more desire to stay and to connect with the people around me. Third boundary is, and this one became very blurred during COVID, but the separation between work and life, especially being in tech and having a remote first job. I think every company has different expectations around what that boundary looks like, and it's been extremely blurred at different times in my career, which is partly me, but partly almost peer pressure within an organization to continue messaging when you're offline or during the weekends, because that's what you're seeing your peers or superiors doing. So those are my 3 boundaries.
Thanks for that, Alex. And something that came up when you were speaking, you spoke about transparency. And I'm wondering, do you feel that Gen Z is less conflict adverse than maybe other generations? And I ask that because that question of transparency, not that Gen Z is infighting or more aggressive, but just that healthy conflict is more of a acceptability. And so I can say, this is how I feel. I want to hear how you feel. I want it to be honest and transparent. And if we disagree, we can handle that.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think by virtue of mental health becoming part of the zeitgeist right now, people are learning how to speak to their feelings in a more productive way. And I think conflict has taken on, of course, when it's executed in a respectful manner, it's a really good thing and can lead to really productive outcomes. Definitely something between like me and my grandparents, for example. I want to speak about the things that feel like misaligned, and sometimes you come up against a wall there. So I think the answer is yes. I think Gen Z is more open to conflict, but takes a much more considerate approach with it, and also is doing it with the goal in mind of having a mutually beneficial outcome.
And final question for you before we move on with Ty as well, because I'd like to hear your 3 boundaries, Ty. What do you feel is important for workplace professionals to understand about that conflict relationship with Gen Z? Whereas, let's say I might be looking at it as from a different generation of being like, I'm actually uncomfortable with that, or I don't really know how to involve myself in that healthy conflict, or how to communicate in a way that's meaningful. What advice would you give to them?
I think the advice that I would give is if you don't address something head on, the suppression is going to lead to more of an explosion later down the line. Like, I think it's much better. And I also think that you won't necessarily need to have conflict if the guidelines are very clear from the onset and you're mutually agreed upon what needs to be done. I think that's where the conflict ends up being born. So ways that you can create system structure and managerial approaches that would avoid that later down the line could be a good way to speak to it. I think also there's a lot of power in just listening and acknowledging what somebody is feeling. I think a lot of times that's all anybody really wants. And rather than being defensive, taking a step back and just validating what someone's feelings are is a really good approach.
Thanks, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
So Ty, what about you? What are 3 boundaries that you think are important for a healthy workplace?
Well, mine are going to be pretty close with Alex's. I am a really big believer in transparency between coworkers and also between like superiors and managerial staff and ownership. That's very important to me, that people understand why things are happening to them in the workplace, why they're being asked to do certain things, and what the boundaries of their role are. I also really value a respectful distance between myself and my coworkers, especially in my industry. It's more common for people to kind of get to know each other in these ways that maybe feel a little raw, maybe a little inappropriate for like a corporate office setting. So I want to be able to trust that my coworkers know that I have good intentions and that they have good intentions for me, and that we can do the job together and then go home, go back to our separate lives. And I guess I would also say that respect for time is a big one for me. that clear boundary between your work life and your personal life, I think is something that Gen Z really would like to maintain. A lot of us, I think, are in the workplace as a way to support ourselves, but we have other passions outside of our career, and we want to be able to maintain those. Having clear expectations about, is my time off work going to be respected? Am I going to be pinged at whatever hour? Those are the things that are very important to
Thanks,
me.
Ty. And something you said specifically caught me, but then I lost it again. You were speaking about this idea of transparency being super important and also needing, kind of wanting to understand why, like the reasoning behind things. And I would say from my experience and what I see in other generations is there isn't so much of that focus on kind of explaining why you need to do things. There can be more of a perception of, hey, I'm hiring you to do a job. This is the job. Just like do the things that I've asked you to do. I shouldn't have to explain why, or I don't think it's efficient to have to explain why. I don't see the value of explaining. Or maybe I feel a bit uncomfortable that I'm being asked to explain something if I feel I'm in a position of, I'm a managerial position or I am in some position of authority. Why can you not just respect and accept that I'm asking you to do this and it needs to be done? Can you explain to someone who might have those thoughts what that benefit of, what that value is, what that mutual success is?
It's about trust. It's about understanding the direction of your company and the value that your work has. I think if your superiors are transparent with you about, like, here are our company's goals for the year, here's how your job fits into that, here's what we expect from you, and here's what we don't expect from you. I think that just clarifies things. It creates an atmosphere of trust in which an employee, especially from Gen Z, can feel like they can express some concerns about what's going on or ask questions and have the faith that those questions are going to be answered truthfully. I just really think that there's nothing worse, nothing that really like kills the relationship between an employee and their manager or their supervisor than a bad outcome kind of appearing out of nowhere. Um, Especially when it comes to like downsizing or layoffs. I think that these are things that need to be like addressed clearly rather than just kind of like appearing out of nowhere. You thought everything was fine, and now all of a sudden, not so much.
So have you had many work experiences that you felt you've achieved that level of transparency and that rationale and that inclusion into, you've understood the business goals, you understood your role in it? How common is that?
It's very uncommon. Not only in terms of like the direction of the company or their specific goals or like how they're doing that year, but just in terms of like managing expectations for a job position. I had a corporate job in which I was repeatedly put into like extremely uncomfortable positions that I actually felt kind of violated my ethics. And nobody ever communicated with me that this was an expectation. Nobody was really willing to hear me when I started talking about how, hey, maybe I feel like I shouldn't be put in these positions as like a newer employee. Maybe this was not clearly communicated to me. That's something that is unfortunately quite common. I think a lot of people have had similar experiences to mine. But yeah, it is something that I look for and seek out, but it is still quite rare.
Thanks, Ty. And are you comfortable to share an example of what that situation would be that you felt it wasn't in your job description and you were like, this actually might go against my values?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to name any names, but I was working. I was doing business immigration analysis. This was during one of my brief stints in the corporate world, and I was basically just doing immigration paralegal work for large corporate clients so that they could obtain visas for foreign national employees, specifically like software engineers, to come over to the States. And I found myself on the phone with a lot of these employees that they were trying to get visas for, having like very difficult and personal conversations with them about, hey, so and so company, not going to name names, said they were going to get my visa, but what if I have a family? Like I have a wife, I have children. Like, what about them? I don't want to like split my family up. And I would be on a call with no supervisor, kind of sitting there in my apartment, because this is all remote, and just thinking about kind of panicking and thinking like, oh my God, like this is completely like out of my depth. I'm not the person that should be handling this. I do paperwork all day, you know?
And so they're really asking like, hey, are you going to actually take care of my entire family? You don't have the answer. The
Exactly.
answer, I'm assuming, was most likely no. And so you're caught in the middle of this feeling like, oh, I didn't understand this was what my experience was going to be.
Exactly. And that's a situation in which, you know, like in terms of legal stuff, like, yeah, maybe the company has like an NDA with the law firm that they can't divulge names before they onboard new employees to work on their team and their case. Um, but it was still really never communicated to me how the level on which I'd be communicating with people and the concerns that I would have to address personally as like a brand new employee.
Thanks for that, Ty. And Alex, quickly for you, before we move on to the next section, has that been common for you? Have you experienced in your roles a lot of that transparency, understanding how your role fits into the larger picture? Have you felt like you received all the information that you needed?
I've had a variety of experiences there. I think my experience is specific in that I loved the company I was working for, and COVID really changed the landscape and eroded a lot of that transparency. So it was interesting to see how one organization can switch basically night and day on something like that. So I did feel like I understood my place in the organization, in the mission that we were driving, what my path to moving up was. Like, I felt supported. And then as we went remote, and there was a lot of, to be fair, like everyone was confused trying to figure out what the work situation looked like now. And I think my company flip-flopped back and forth on a lot of messaging that eroded trust at pretty much every level. So I've had both. I'm at a startup right now where I feel like there's an immense amount of transparency. We have, like, as elements of the product are being built out, they're demoed to us internally by the engineering team. We have a straight line to the CEO, which I think is so cool. I've never had that. So I've kind of had a lot of experience there.
Nice. Thanks, Alex. All right, so let's move to the next section. So people, not positions, is something we also heard quite a lot about. This idea that there really needs to be humanization. Alex, you just spoke about having a direct line to the CEO, like it feels like a person-to-person connection. The business seems very person-oriented. And there's also this expectation and need for collaboration, that respect that happens in collaborative environments. And we can go to the next slide. And so some of the things we really heard in terms of person, not position, is this recognition as individuals, as people, as humans, and bringing those experiences, perspectives, the fact that you have individual lives outside of work, and really being acknowledged, not only for your role, but for who you are as an individual. Investment. So this is something, Alex, you spoke about as well, and you concurred, Ty. This idea of, working for a company is not just a one way, like I do my role and then I get a check. It really is a deeper two-way investment in this respect. And also in training was something that came up a lot. This idea of being able to be educated and to grow with a company, which both Ty and you, Alex, felt you're not really seeing anymore in corporations and workplaces. A really huge emphasis on training. And I think, Ty, it might have been you who brought up that you see on Instagram, and this is a kind of reflection of that, all of these programs that are offering to take, tens of thousands of dollars from your generation for the purpose of training. I need to train to be a coder. I need to train to do this. I need to train to do that. And Alex, you mentioned that in one of your companies, one of the core things you looked for and would not agree to join a company if they didn't do this is train you. You really want it to be trained. So there's that growth element that's really important that I want to speak on too. And also this idea of no code switching, which I think plays with that transparency element. Alex, you spoke about small talk as well, and like the increase of small talk after the pandemic and kind of that empty intimacy and how that all correlates together. But moving beyond that idea of small talk pleasantries and really into deep, genuine understanding, empathy among team members. I think, Karen, what we spoke about in the first theme, that idea of maybe implicit conversation or things that aren't stated or the way things are done doesn't really work with Gen Z. And so while other generations may code switch and say, this is my corporate lingo, this is how I speak in my daily life, Gen Z really wants to mix that. They want to bring themselves. And so you might see communications or things that are more casual, are more direct, are more transparent. And so you guys really prefer not to have to do that. You probably have the capability to, but it wouldn't be a happy environment and you'd prefer not to. So I'll stop there and we can go to the next slide. And I'm curious to hear more about this idea of empty intimacy, about language, about bringing yourself to work. What does person and position not mean to you? And how do you distinguish like authentic connections, authentic workplaces between ones that feel superficial, ones that don't feel genuine?
Yeah, I can kick us off. I think something that is really powerful coming from a person who's in a position of leadership is vulnerability. And I think that's also a hot word that everyone is saying all the time right now. But looking back on my career, the best performances that I've ever had, the best team dynamics I've ever had are when my manager was willing to share anything about who they were. And it makes you feel more connected to them as a person, and that authenticity, whether it's, I think the example I gave to you when we were prepping, Natalie, is how many calls do you get on a Monday and people say, how was your weekend? And you say, it was good. How was yours? And there's no details. And of course, nobody needs to divulge anything personal if they're not comfortable doing that. But if you're stepping into a position of leadership and trying to make your underlings feel humanly connected, I think sharing anything about yourself, your experience, your struggles, what you're still learning, like just being a full human being goes a really long way and shows that there's legitimacy to the intimacy. And then you can trust whatever they're saying to your face is probably what they're saying behind closed doors as well.
Thanks for that, Alex. So I want to share something, an anecdote for the audience that might be interesting because you might be thinking, okay, I understand that, but like, what does that look like in a workplace environment, right? Maybe we don't have half an hour to have a conversation about how everyone truly feels at the start of a Monday meeting. So something I've seen with a partner and actually is pulling in these images of different emotions and saying, where do you sit today? And you can actually, there's some, not necessarily positive emotions or ones that are more challenging. And just a short little, 5 to 10 seconds. Oh, like this is why I'm anxious today, or this is why I'm having a really great day, or this is, so it has a bit of, it has efficiency, it has speed, and it also has that really beautiful vulnerability element as well to it. So that's something that I really loved personally, and that would be a way that people could adopt that. So Ty, what about you? What makes a workplace very authentic? What makes relationships authentic versus something that feels superficial?
For me, it is a matter of building like that the avenues of building connection are not based on like empty things, such as I remember we were talking about like company happy hours, which are I feel like just kind of places where people's boundaries are like habitually stepped over. But also just like feeling like you could tell your manager something personal about your life that could affect your performance and not be punished for it. The trust that like if you're having a hard time with something, if you're dealing with a personal issue, especially if you're suffering a kind of illness or something, you want to know that your manager and your coworkers are going to be there for you and not judge you, not see you as like a weak link or something. I feel like also goes back into this like concept of companies investing in their employees and kind of nurturing their growth. It's impossible to create a nurturing environment if you're always if you can't ever not be your best self. Obviously we all want to be our best selves at work, but there are times when like the personal and the professional do kind of cross over and they affect each other.
Thanks for that, Ty. That's a really good point. Is it reasonable to expect that someone can only be their best self every day? And then if that is the expectation, then you inherently have superficiality, right? Because no one's 100%. No one's having a great day every day. No one had a great weekend every weekend. If they did, I want their phone number. So it's like, okay, am I allowed and what is allowable? And do I understand fully what those boundaries are? So I feel comfortable and confident in how I'm bringing myself to work. Awesome. So I'm going to move on to the next theme because I want to make sure we have time for questions. And this is something that came up, not necessarily with these words, but we did hear this consistently. And we think it's important to share because there is this theme around Gen Z in the workforce, this idea that they are lazy, that they don't want responsibility, that they are job hoppers, that, there's a lot of instability and insecurity in hiring a Gen Z person. I think I saw a stat 74% of managers say Gen Z is the most difficult generation to work with. So there's a lot of tension that's happening. And really what was shared with us and what we've even seen supported in broader trends in society is this idea of infantilization in the workplace. So this question of chicken or the egg, what's really coming first? How much of it is Gen Z's, laziness, differing kind of perspective on responsibility in the workplace, and how much is also that workplaces are more infantilized today. And so there isn't that same autonomy, there isn't that same level of responsibility that's given to you that you can step into that role to then be responsible. And how much is micromanagement creating an environment where Gen Z is, demotivated at work and doesn't actually have opportunities to make real change, doesn't feel that they have responsibilities to then step into a role of responsibility, all of those elements. So we're going to discuss some of that. And Ty, you had a really great quote here. I want to see companies trusting young people more to not be in a situation where they're going to be micromanaged or be picked over or be afraid to say, I don't know, I need someone to help me. I think these are things that made workplaces stronger. I think these are things that made American industry stronger in past generations. And I was really caught by that quote. And so I looked up some articles and some studies. And for the audience, there are quite a lot of studies that have come out around this idea of infantilization or recessed maturity, not only in the workplace, but in American society in general. So we're wondering at Vytal, is there a relationship between the two? We can go to the next slide as well. So this idea of dismantling the myth, which is what Gen Z wants to communicate, that it is a stereotype that they do not actually want to work, but that they are kind of handicapped in a way in terms of that infantilization, that micromanagement, the environment. And that's part of the issue. And so they're asking, well, can we have roles that kind of solve for that, give us opportunity and responsibility so that we can showcase all of these skills that we actually have that we feel are super relevant to a workplace. So challenging that notion of just professional laziness and really looking at are you creating an environment for us that is allowing us to step into a role of responsibility, is allowing us to learn and grow. I think training is a part of that as well. Maybe if a company isn't very into training or doesn't feel it's an efficient use of time, that can create a kind of demotivating or fearful factor for younger employees to say, I don't really know what's appropriate here. I don't know how far I can go. I don't know what's expected or what's acceptable. Micromanagement to empowerment. So that idea of seeking that autonomy in their roles, and really wanting that collaboration is a theme we heard consistently, that idea of Gen Z wants to be participatory in their role. And if given that participatory nature, and it can be in small ways even, it leads to a better outcome and more employee retention. And modern professionalism. So this idea that maybe by traditional standards, we may be seen as unprofessional, but we are actually challenging the healthiness and the efficacy of how professionalism has been determined in the past. And we actually think we might have certain ways forward that are helpful, that are healthy, that are positive for a workforce, that with collaboration, we'd be able to communicate and the entire workforce would improve. Because, Gen Z is going to take up majority of the workforce. And so really learning how to evolve with them is important. And Alex, you said, we want to see positive change, trying to undo a lot of the harms and unstable foundation that is falling apart beneath us. And for me, that means working at a job where I'm helping a company only make money is like soul crushing. So that idea of also wanting value, wanting meaning, wanting purpose in your work and not just a paycheck. So we can go to the next slide. So you both shared times when you felt kind of micromanaged or infantilized or not respected at work. How did you address that moment? And what do you want employers to understand about you and your generation's capability and desire for work?
I think a lot of the organizational elements that we're talking about are reflected in society right now, where it's a very systemic thing of voices that weren't valued before. Now we expect that our voices are heard. And I think that it's unfair to say a whole generation of people is lazy and doesn't want to work. I think if anything, that's probably more correlated to your upbringing and whatever your prior experiences were there. But doing any task that's assigned to you is always going to be important. Like early in your career, I think you're not better than any task that's given to you. So you should be open-minded and you should be a hard worker. And then in correlation and as a result, you should be valued as a human being. Like those two things are so interconnected and they're just also interwoven. So that's, I think, more than my quote of working at a place that's only making money for a company is soul crushing. It's like, if you're doing good work and that's not being appreciated and you're not being valued as a human, that's more soul crushing, but you do need to have the work ethic. So it's, yeah. I don't know if that answered your question. I have too many thoughts on this.
It does. It does. I'll jump to Ty and then I'll ask some follow-ups too. Ty,
Yeah.
go ahead. What do you think?
I mean, I just want to echo what Alex said about work ethic. I think it really is, it can create this like horrible dynamic because there is this kind of general myth that Gen Z, we're lazy, we do not want to work. And I don't think that's true. But I do think that a lot of young people who show strong initiative and a strong work ethic are like ostensibly taken advantage of at work. And over time, they just stop emotionally investing in what they're doing. And they burn out and they completely check out. I think this is why we have so much like quiet quitting. Because people are just saddled with work. They don't see any change on the horizon. Their company's like, you're doing a great job. Here's more stuff to do. Instead of kind of offering incentives to grow, offering opportunities like to improve their skills, to grow new skills. It kind of creates this like endless treadmill where I think a lot of young people are kind of thinking, well, like, okay, I am a hard worker, but if that means that I'm just going to be saddled with like doing the work of everyone else who's burned out until I'm burned out, like, why do I want to be a part of this workplace, you know?
Absolutely. So I'm curious, I want to talk about growth a bit, and I want to share some recommendations that you guys gave during prep before we jump into the Q&A session. But I'm curious, Ty, why do you think the media, workplaces, managers believe that Gen Z is lazy or believe that Gen Z doesn't want to work? Do you think there's any truth to that?
I mean, I think that this is a classic like panic. I think every generation is like kind of baffled by the newer generation that's coming up in their worlds. Every generation of young people kind of steps on what the older generation thinks is right, thinks is normal. I think the difference here is that in past generations, we did have this kind of this American dream, I think, was more fully within people's grasp. It was like, yeah, if you were a hardworking person and you were personable, you could walk in, you could shake somebody's hand. Maybe, yeah, it did depend on like the color of your skin or your gender, but there was also a sense of kind of limitless growth, that if you were willing to demonstrate your work ethic and your intellect, then you could rise as high as as you like. And I don't think that young people feel that way about the workplace right now. I think that in general, the job market kind of rewards legacy. It's looking for employees who are finished products, like that you can just kind of snap into place, rather than people with a lot of potential and creativity who could actually grow more if the company was willing to invest in them. So yeah, I don't think that there's any truth to this idea that we are a lazy people. I don't think that our generation would be so obsessed with entrepreneurship if we were that lazy. You know what I mean?
Yes, thanks for that, Ty. So I'm going to quickly share some examples you guys gave of what you'd like to see in workplaces, and I'm going to jump to Q&A. So you said showing people a tangible example of upper mobility. Obviously benefits, which are super important to you feeling secure, listening to their employees, not as much hierarchy, which means collaborative elements, feedback loops that have actual measurements to them. So everyone has mutual agreements about what success looks like. In-person connection was actually preferred, not just digital, which might be surprising for some people in the audience that Gen Z is actually craving in-person connection, mentorship, growth in their workforce roles. And that HR, I thought this was interesting, should be a more consistent presence, not only in reaction or minor moments. So not this idea that HR comes in to be the bad guy to fire you, or when there's an issue happening, or maybe some allegation, but really that HR should have a role like any other role in a company of being visible and consistent on a daily and weekly basis. And we actually just had a question pop up, so I'm going to. So we have a question. Neil's wondering how we can better educate company leaders. It's something around connecting these cultural positives more clearly to growth rather than its culture or its business growth. So he'd like to hear what you think.
Will you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, I'll read it exactly. So Neil said, thank you. Really enjoyed learning from you all, the stories and insight you shared, trust, transparency, feeling valued, really track with what actually creates strong company culture across all generations. I'm wondering how we better educate company leaders. I think it's something around connecting these cultural positives more clearly to growth rather than its culture or growth. Curious to hear, what do you think?
Yeah. It's a really good question because there's so much data to prove that diverse teams, female-led teams, minority-led teams do better, perform better, which leads to growth and revenue. So I don't really know where the disconnect or mismatch is there, but I think getting the right people in leadership, i.e. like every single one of us should be able to look in senior, mid, and low-level leadership and see someone that looks like us. I think that's a really good place to start, is just representation and having people advocating for the right cultural alignment at that level, which doesn't always exist now.
Thanks, Alex.
To that end, I also want to say, like, the matter of getting that right person in leadership, that right person, whoever they are, is interested in what their employees are doing. They're interested on actually getting to know their employees and how they feel about their work, what it consists of, what the common difficulties they run into are, and not seeing it as, oh, this person's like having an issue. How do we get rid of this redundancy in my workforce?
Mm-hmm. I also think, going back to the vulnerability piece, if managers can be vulnerable when they are not doing their best in an area, or where they need help, where they're still learning or growing, and they can then delegate some of that responsibility to a team lead or someone who's a Gen Z representative who works under them, it creates this collaborative that would just solve a lot of the different issues in terms of collaboration, communication, upward mobility. And then I think the values alignment would be from the bottom up and the top down, connecting so that you're actually enforcing those on the day-to-day level.
Thanks for that, Alex. So we are at time, so I'm just going to ask one more question out of the ones that we have, and I'm going to select something that could be most impactful for the audience. And Alex, you might have just answered this in your own way. What's something that's inexpensive or simple for organizations to do, but is impactful in terms of retaining more Gen Z talent?
Yeah, I think the leadership representation is one. I also think inclusion groups can go a long way, and they don't cost anything. Like, if they need to raise money for events or anything, you can fund it. But for example, the first company I joined out of college, we had Outforce, which was for LGBTQ plus. We had just so many different ones. Earth Force, which was for conservation and green energy and stuff like that. So if you can find a community of people that share your values in some way within your organization, that's free and goes a long way.
Thanks, Alex. What about you, Ty?
Yeah, yeah, to build off that, I think just like one-on-one conversation between managers and employees, or between like corporate leaders and employees. I think that goes a really long way. Just that all that is an investment of time to establish communication. And I don't know, it lets people feel heard, and I think it builds trust.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Ty and Alex. We are at time, so unfortunately ran out of time for the other questions. Monta, do you have any closing remarks?
No, that's it. Thank you to you both for taking time out of your busy work days to have this conversation with us. Thanks for all of you in the audience that tuned in. We will be sending the presentation around as well as this recording if there are some of your colleagues that wish to view it. And stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Ty.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.